What's up and welcome back to another video on Freewell Photos. Today we are looking at Brilliance AI and making sure that the settings make sense for your workflow. I'm going to share my settings as well. Now, if you don't want to watch the video and you'd rather go to a blog post, check the description box. There's going to be a link to a post that I made and you could just read through a lot of the stuff and see screenshots. But for those of you who like videos, let's go ahead and dive in. So first thing that we want to do, if you're on a Mac, you're going to come up to the ON1 Photo RAW, click on Preferences, and then you're going to come over to Brilliance AI. Now, if you're on a Windows, I think you click File, or it's under Edit and then Preferences down at the bottom. I will trust that you know how to get there if you're using a Windows machine. All right, so once you have this dialog box popped up, the very first thing is white balance default. I leave this to as shot. The reason is I use Sony a7R4, Canon R6 Mark II, and the Sony a6700. All of those cameras, they do a great job at capturing the white balance when I'm photographing. Plus, I'm photographing in RAW plus JPEG in most cases. So if the RAW file needs to be modified, I do that manually. I don't need Brilliance AI to do that, but usually it comes out. We'll take a look at this photo that we have up with Mr. Waffles here. Then the next thing is apply no noise AI to a RAW photo above, and then you get to choose a number. I had this at one point set to 800, but after testing it out on a few images, I found that 1600 works the best for me. Now, if your camera is a little bit older, you may want to put this a little bit lower. But if you have a relatively new camera, I would say something that came out in the past 8 years, 1600 is probably going to be okay. It's a personal preference. You'll have to decide what you would like to do. The good news is ON1 has some really good no noise AI or noise reduction software. So you're in good hands if you decide to activate this. But if you decide not to, then you can turn it off. But for me, 1600 seems to be the most appropriate for the way that I photograph. And I guess that's also important. I try to get my exposure within 1/3 of a stop plus or minus based off of, or 1/3 of a stop plus or minus on the scene that I'm photographing. So if I'm in a darker room, then I know that the photo is already going to come out dark. I don't want to increase my ISO unless I absolutely must. I'd rather add additional light, even if it's not good light. All right. And there's really no such thing as not good light. If there's different balanced colored lights, all right? Because the worst thing, I just turned that photo black and white. But at least I didn't have to crank my ISO and compromise the integrity of the overall image. That's my personal preference, all right? More coming on that later. Then, of course, we have apply portrait AI to prominent faces, and I leave that turned on. Most of my images are of my children or of my family, so I have faces in a lot of my images, all right, except for the one that I'm showing you today. Then we're going to come down here to customize Brilliance AI. Now, some of you may have seen this, but let me just kind of talk you through it. So for the amount, I like it at 70. Now, the reason I like it at 70 is because with my Sony cameras, which is what I'm photographing mostly with now, since I've switched from Canon over to Sony, 70 seems to be the right, like the sweet spot for my a6700 as well as my a7R4. All right. With my Canon, it depends on the scene, but I may need to pull that down a little bit more. It's something about the sensors. So I had to tune this to the camera that I'm using the most. So that's why I have it set to 70. But what I find when I use my Canon camera, I usually pull this down somewhere in the 60s, but it's not too far off. All right. So 70 just seems to work the best for me. I leave my midtones alone because for me, the midtones gives me the most flexibility of modifying the overall brightness of the image. All right. It's not necessarily opening shadows or increasing highlights or decreasing highlights when you reduce the midtones. But it's just giving like a central boost to the image to brighten it up. All right. And I don't want Brilliance AI to do that for me, because I like to think through my own settings of what I want to do with my midtones. And I really just want to use Brilliance AI as a tool to help me get the edit done faster, but I still want my own creative workflow built into this. All right. And that's why I leave midtones set to 0. Then I have contrast. And what ends up happening with the contrast is it's going to, all of my raw images, regardless of what sensor I'm using, they are always flat. All right. Raw images, they just come out looking flat and dull. And you can kind of see that in this photo in the background here. It's just a little flat and dull. It doesn't really have much life. So what I like to do is push contrast, because I love contrasted images. All right. So I push the contrast just a little bit on all of my raw files, and that doesn't hurt me if I want to use dynamic contrast. Sometimes I even go and push this contrast slider a little bit more under tone and color after I apply Brilliance AI. Now, getting back to the temperature, I leave that set to 0 because, again, I'm not impacting my white balance since I have this set to as shot. And you can actually see over here on the right hand side where it says auto white balance required. And that's talking about this color amount. When I activate this a little bit later, you'll see what happens. But essentially, if you don't have this set to auto, then the color slider in Brilliance AI will not activate. And I actually appreciate that, because I like to maintain the control over my colors. And, I'm really enjoying the ability to fine tune this tool to work in my creative workflow, as opposed to being strong armed into doing one thing or the other. All right. And then, of course, the last slider here is vibrance. And many people understand that vibrance is probably one of the more useful saturation type sliders. And I use a little bit of vibrance because, remember, there's no life to a raw file. Sometimes there could be if there's a lot of color in the scene already. But even still, those files are probably relatively flat. So I add a little bit of vibrance, and it just complements the contrast that I'm adding into the overall image. And then, of course, I have apply local adjustments automatically turned off. The reason I have this turned off is because I have not, in any of the images that I've tested, and I tested this on over 200 images, which, for some people, that's either a really large sample size or a really, really small sample size. What I found is I'd rather make my own local adjustments with the corrections that I would like to make, instead of letting ON1 make those decisions for me. I know some people are having great results with leaving the apply local adjustments automatically turned on. I personally did not. Out of those 200 images, I would say maybe 24 of them were actually something that I preferred. It's not saying that this tool is broken or that it is irrelevant or useless. It's actually just saying it doesn't work for my creative style. All right. And that's important. If you know your style, then you know what tools can and can't work for you. And that's why I enjoy that ON1 allows us to turn that off, so I don't have to turn them off manually later. All right. So those are all the settings inside of preferences. Let me hit OK. And I'm going to go ahead and activate this so you can see what happens to my image. Again, this is shot on the Sony A6700. 50 millimeter lens, and I shot this at 6,400 ISO. All right. So again, what I was doing here was trying to get this within 1/3 of a stop under or over, I'm sorry, 1/3 of a stop under what would have been proper exposure. The reason for that, I can recover a lot of shadow detail, which I just did here. So if I turn this off, you can see the image is dark. And then when I turn this on, it's going to recover a lot of that shadow detail, and then it applies the noise reduction. And for me, this is a good image, or at least an image that I can start working on and hopefully tweaking to make it a little bit better. But this does give me a great starting point. All right. Now, I mentioned earlier the color amount. I turned the white balance to as shot, and you can see I am not getting the ability to move this slider, which is fine because I personally don't need that. Now, when I come down to tone and color, I can see that it made a minor adjustment to the as shot as far as pushing the magentas a little bit, but this is okay. All right. To me, that's perfectly fine because this is how it came out of camera. But what I really enjoy is that it didn't modify saturation or vibrance at all for us here. Now, on this particular image, it realized that maybe you don't really need to crank vibrance on the photo, which I slightly agree. But if I wanted to, I can just come in here and push the vibrance just a little bit. And I don't know if that's helping or hurting because this is relatively a gray image. But let's take a look at the levels. So here's how Brilliance AI modified the image. Let's see if we can turn this off. And so what I'll do is I'm going to post both of these histograms on the screen here, so that way you can see what's happening. So with Brilliance AI turned off, this is what the histogram looks like. And with it turned on, this is what the histogram looks like. What it's doing is it's boosting pretty much everything that's in the midtones and pulling some of those shadows out here, but it's not pushing me too far to the right because this was a darker scene. All right. I have photographed this pretty decently because this, this was much darker than I had even anticipated it to be. But essentially, using Brilliance AI, I was able to recover all of that darker detail that was in the image. All right. I know I went over a lot, but the goal here is for you to understand Brilliance AI is a tool that you can use. And in one click, I was able to get a photo that went from this to this really, really fast. And that's the power of using ON1 Photo RAW. Now, if you want to pick up a copy of ON1, consider using my coupon code FreeWillPhotos20, or you can just use the link down in the description box below. All of the money that I'd earn from ON1 or from referring you to them, it goes right back into the channel, purchasing equipment and updating, paying for subscriptions, stuff like that. So if you want to help me continue bringing content to the YouTube community here, then by all means, please consider using those codes. But if you found value, smash the like button. And until next time, I want you to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.